Japan has just shocked the world. A nation once seen as America's most loyal ally has made a move that could change the global balance of power. For decades, Tokyo stood firmly behind Washington, politically, militarily, and economically. But that era may be over. Under Prime Minister Chigaro Ishiba, Japan is no longer content to play the obedient partner. It's charting its own path, even if that means breaking with decades of US policy. The signal came quietly but powerfully, when Japan resumed oil imports from Russia, defying the sanctions enforced by the United States and its Western allies. What looked like a minor trade decision was, in truth, a declaration of independence. For years, Japan relied on American approval for its economic moves, but after repeated silence from Washington, especially during Japan's growing financial crisis, Tokyo decided it could no longer wait. With inflation rising, the yen weakening, and debt soaring past 260% of GDP, Japan had to act in its own interest. Its purchase of 600,000 barrels of Russian oil wasn't about politics, it was about survival. This decision marks something much deeper than energy trade. It reflects a global shift that's been building quietly beneath the surface, a world slowly turning away from the US dollar. For nearly a century, the dollar has been the undisputed king of global trade, the currency that controlled markets, debt, and diplomacy. But now, cracks are appearing in that foundation. Across the globe, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been constructing an alternative system. They're conducting trade in local currencies, issuing bonds in Chinese yuan, and building new financial institutions designed to bypass the dollar altogether. More than 20 other countries have either joined or expressed interest in joining this alliance. Brazil has already taken the leap, issuing international loans in yuan. Slowly but surely, the world's economic center of gravity is shifting eastward. Japan, long the backbone of America's presence in Asia, is watching this transformation closely. For decades, it has held more than $1 trillion in US bonds, helping to fund America's wars, bailouts, and deficits. But now that same Japan is quietly discussing selling off portions of those US assets. Such an idea would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, but today it's a real possibility. The logic is simple. If Washington won't help Japan stabilize its economy, why should Tokyo continue financing America's debt? The silence from Washington is becoming impossible to ignore. While Japan warns about its worsening debt crisis, the United States offers no assistance, no reassurance, not even a symbolic gesture. Japan is beginning to see itself not as a partner, but as a tool that's been used and forgotten. And in response, it's turning inward, toward self-preservation, self-reliance, and independence. At the same time, the United States is drowning in its own economic troubles. National debt is approaching $37 trillion, and foreign appetite for US bonds is drying up fast. Should global demand collapse, interest rates would surge, borrowing costs would explode, and the dollar's global dominance could start to crumble. That's the nightmare scenario Washington doesn't want to face, but Japan's latest actions are pushing the world closer to it. Tokyo isn't acting out of hostility, it's acting out of necessity. Since the Fukushima disaster in 2011, Japan has struggled to meet its energy needs. It depends heavily on liquefied natural gas and oil imports. When sanctions on Russia threatened that supply, Japan realized that following US orders could mean risking its own stability. So it chose a different path, one that ensures energy security, even at the cost of political friction. This pragmatic decision reveals a larger truth. Western unity is weakening. Japan, once the model student of American-aligned policy, is now making independent choices that openly undermine US strategy. Other nations are watching, and they may soon follow. The more countries act on their own economic realities rather than American expectations, the faster the old world order collapses. Behind the scenes, Japan is also moving closer to China. It's not an alliance of friendship, but of convenience. Both nations understand the global tide is turning. The yuan is becoming a serious contender on the world stage. Chinese banks are helping other nations issue debt in yuan, establish new payment systems, and break free from dollar dependency. Even countries once firmly in the US orbit, like Japan, are beginning to see China not just as a rival, but as a financial partner. In Brazil, the shift is already visible. The country has started issuing panda bonds, sovereign debt sold in yuan, to Chinese investors. For emerging economies, it's a lifeline that doesn't rely on Western approval or the unpredictable swings of US interest rates. If Brazil succeeds, others will follow. And Japan is likely to be part of that new financial ecosystem. Meanwhile, trust in the US financial system is quietly evaporating. Every time Washington uses the dollar as a weapon, freezing assets, imposing sanctions, or blocking payment systems, more nations realize how vulnerable they are. The lesson from Russia's frozen reserves was clear. If it can happen to one, it can happen to anyone. That fear is pushing countries to diversify and to prepare for a post-dollar world. Back in Japan, the transformation is already visible. Bond yields are rising sharply, signaling a major shift in domestic capital. Japanese investors are pulling billions back home, repatriating funds once invested in US debt. In 2024 alone, they moved more than $180 billion into Japanese government bonds. This is not just a trend, it's a message. The age of blind trust in the dollar is ending. Japan's pivot toward the yuan doesn't mean it will completely abandon the United States, but it does mean that Tokyo's loyalty now has limits. The quiet compliance that defined post-war Japan is fading. A new generation of policymakers is emerging, ones who believe their nation's survival depends on independence, not obedience. This shift may look gradual, but it's historic. For decades, the US dollar was more than a currency. It was a symbol of power, control, and stability. But that symbol is now being challenged from every direction. BRICS nations are expanding. Global debt is exploding, and America's closest allies are beginning to hedge their bets. The question now isn't whether the dollar will lose its dominance, it's how fast it will happen. Japan has simply chosen to be early rather than late. By trading with Russia, by diversifying away from US bonds, and by opening financial ties with China, it's preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer king. This isn't rebellion, it's evolution. The start of a new financial era where nations act not out of loyalty to a superpower, but out of loyalty to their own survival. The United States can no longer assume automatic support from its allies. The silence it offered Japan has turned into a wake-up call heard across the world. Japan's move toward the yuan might seem small today, but it represents a massive psychological shift, a moment when the world's third-largest economy decided to stop waiting for America's permission. The future is being rewritten in real time. The dollar's reign isn't over yet, but the first cracks are visible. And this time they're coming not from America's enemies, but from its oldest friend.